Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Rosalind Phoenix, and I am your host of the Inside Out podcast, where we believe in healing from the inside out. Now, I am a licensed Christian therapist by profession, and so I am very passionate about people being healed, delivered, and set free from the bondages that they have been carrying for years. So, if you walk this journey with me, you are going to discover that healing from the inside out is definitely possible. Welcome to the debut broadcast of Inside Out Healing, where we will be discussing from trauma to triumph. And I want you all to know that this podcast is being dedicated to my maternal grandmother, Ernestine Bazile, who would be celebrating her 100th birthday today, July 3rd. 2025 would be her 100th birthday. And me sharing my story is actually the confirmation of a prophetic word that she spoke over my life at the age of 16. She told me that I would be God's mouthpiece and that I would change a generation. And so I must admit that when I was first given this assignment, I was nervous because I knew that it would cause me to be transparent. I knew that I would have to be vulnerable in places that I am not used to allowing people in. But I will say, I had to understand that I am not called to be a people pleaser, but I am called to be a God pleaser. And as long as I am pleasing Him, there is nothing that I have to worry about. Now, I know you all may be saying, well, how did I arrive at the title Inside Out Healing? Well, I'm glad you asked because it was based off of a conversation that I had with God. And I said, what would you allow me to call this podcast? And He gave me the name Inside Out Healing. But it also speaks to the line of work that I do. I am a licensed Christian counselor by profession, and so, a lot of times, a word that I give to my clients is that healing is a choice. Healing is something that starts in the mind, it starts from the inside and it begins to manifest itself outwardly. And I want you all to understand that both healing and trauma have a look. See, a lot of times we focus on trauma having a certain look where we can tell when somebody is depressed because their countenance is lower, their countenance is saddened. But on the other side of that, when you begin to heal, it also has a look. It has a vibrancy that cannot be denied. And so that's what I endeavor to do through this podcast is to show you how to heal from the inside out. And so, this first episode of my podcast will walk you through my personal grief journey of one of the most significant losses that I have ever experienced. And that was the death of my maternal grandmother. She was the one that spoke destiny into my life. She was the one that told me all the things that I would become. And her death seemed to me to be very untimely because I just knew that she had more life to live. But before I go into my story, I want to explain to you what trauma really means. And so when you think about the word trauma, trauma is any type of distress that is caused by a stressful situation. It could be an accident, it could be you being abused, or it could be you experiencing a loss, whether death or non-death losses. But any type of thing you have experienced, if it is trauma, it will disrupt your emotions. And I know that this death disrupted my emotions. It caused a lot of stress. It made it almost impossible for me to navigate certain emotions. And so now I'm going to tell you all when and how the pain started. So I remember it was the year 1997, and my mother and I were in a church service, and all I can remember is we were receiving a phone call in the middle of the service that stated my grandmother had to be rushed to the hospital. Now, we did not know what was going on, but all I can remember is we rushed out of church, jumped in the car, rushed to the hospital, and I remember on my way there, anxiety was at an all-time high. I was worried, I was frustrated, and I remember saying to myself, God, this can't be real. You can't be taking my rock out from under me. This can't be the end of my grandmother's life. And I had to say, God, you can't take my cinnamon roll, buddy. Okay, so a little caveat, the cinnamon roll, that was one of our favorite foods. And so whenever I would go to my grandmother's house, there was always a hot cinnamon roll waiting for me. And so at this moment, I'm thinking, please don't take my cinnamon roll, buddy. Please don't take my public transportation, buddy, because there would be another thing that we would do. She would scoop me up, say, hey, let's get on the bus. Let's hang out downtown Houston. Let's eat. Let's shop. Let's just have a day to ourselves. And so that was one of the most significant moments in my relationship with her. And so I'm thinking, please don't let her die. But when we got to the hospital, my grandmother was sitting up. She was talking and she was looking fairly well. But according to the doctor, she had had a stroke. And so she remained in the hospital for a few days and then she was released. But however, her health declines continued. And so she would have many strokes, meaning that every other day she was having strokes. There were things going on, but we didn't know exactly what was going on. And so I watched her go from this vibrant, feisty, little short statured woman, similar to me, short statured, and I did not know what was happening, but I watched her go from that vibrancy to being someone that needed around the clock care. She no longer was able to walk on her own and she needed assistance to do basic things. But because my family had not had an opportunity to provide the home health care assistance that she needed, at the age of 16, I became a caregiver to an ailing grandparent. Now, imagine the transition that came with being a teenager, because at 16 or 17, you're not thinking that you're going to enter into an assistant caregiver role. You think that all your focus is at that moment is getting out of high school, going to prom. What is life after high school? What about college? And so instead of thinking about those things, I remember folding wheelchairs and taking them and putting them in and out of the car and driving to doctor's appointments or sitting with my mother as we waited for my grandmother to get out of her doctor's appointments. And all of that continued from the year 1997 to the year 2000. So for 3 years, I was actually considered an assistant caregiver. And so now, fast forward to the last memory that I have of my maternal grandmother, and that was November 5th, 2000. That was a Sunday. And I remember going to her house that day. And instead of going to church, she said, well, hey, why don't you just stay at home with me today so we can sing gospel songs? And so if there's anything that you know or want to know about my grandmother, she loved to sing. And so when she was in better health and could walk and do all of these things, she would walk around her house. She would be humming, she would be singing, all these kind of things. And so that particular day, she said, let's just stay home and sing. And so I agreed, and I'm glad that I did, because I did not know that that would be the very last time or the very last moment that I would have with her. And so when the visit was over that particular Sunday, something felt very strange. Something felt very odd and unique. And that day, my grandmother told me that she loved me, which is something she frequently did. But this I love you was a little heavy. It was more intense. And I began to ponder what all of that really meant. And so when I left her house, driving back to my home, I was still thinking about why was the I love you so different. And so fast forward to Tuesday, November 7th, 2000, I remember I was coming home from college. I had gone to take my classes for the day, and I just decided, hey, I'm going to go home. I'm going to relax. I'm just going to sit down from a long day of school. But I remember a few minutes later, my grandfather called me and he said, listen, your grandmother slipped and she fell and she's hurt. And so I'm thinking, okay, maybe she was just in one of her independent moments where she tried to stand up and walk on her own and something happened, because that's another thing about her. She was a very independent person. I called her the independent Black woman. She would never ask for help. She never desired for anybody to assist because she felt like if I have the strength to do what's needed, I'm going to do it. And so I thought that's what was happening, but unfortunately, that was not the case. And so a few minutes later, I received a phone call from my mom. Now, take it, I was at home alone when I was receiving that news. And so when my mom called me, I could tell by the sound of her voice that something was not right. I could tell that it was not going to be good. And so I remember her telling me, she said, your grandmother didn't make it. The stroke was massive this time, and it took her all the way from us, and she's gone. And all I can remember at that time, at that very moment, being alone, was holding the phone and being absolutely too numb to cry. I did not have any tears at that moment. I was weak. I really was in a moment of denial because I did not want to accept the reality that the matriarch of our family was gone. And so every emotion known to man cropped up in my mind at that moment. I was full of denial. I was bitter. I was angry. First of all, angry with God. I was angry with life, and I was guilty. So I'm pretty sure you all are wondering, well, why would you be guilty? I was guilty because I felt like I should have been there at the time of her death. And I felt like if I had been there, I would have been able to preserve her life. I felt like if I was there, one more minute, few more seconds of CPR, that could have saved her life. But that wasn't the case. And not only that, my relationship with God at that moment became very conflicted. Now, I was saved, sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost. And the church people say that with a mighty burning fire. I was all of that, but my relationship was conflicted. And I remember asking God at that moment, how could you? That was my question. How could you? How could you take the person that held me together? How could you take the person that spoke so much goodness over my life? Because I felt on the day that she passed away, the day that she died, I felt as though something died on the inside of me. And not only did I question God, I began to feel a sense of jealousy because I would see other people that still had their grandmothers with them. They could still go out, they could eat, they could shop, they could talk, they could have moments together. And here I was not able to do that anymore because my grandmother passed away at the age of 75, which I thought was very untimely because I felt like she still had more life to live. I felt that she still had more dinners to cook. She was the chef of the household. So I felt like this is not over. She has more to give. And I felt like God was not giving me or did not give me enough time to say goodbye. He did not even give me a time to bring closure to the situation. And so I remember being so traumatized and being so angry with God that I said, I will never do ministry again. At that time, I knew that I was called to the preaching ministry, but I said at this moment, I will never pick up another mic. At this moment, I said, I will never share the gospel of Jesus Christ ever again. I will never serve in ministry again. I will never be a part of another church again. I will never be connected to another leader again. That's just how distraught this death was for me. And not only that, I had already decided that I would not even finish college. At the time, I was getting my bachelor's degree, but I said, I'm not going to even finish. What's the use? She's not going to be here to see me walk across the stage. So I felt like there was no need for that. And my mother encouraged me to go ahead and finish my degree. And I'm glad that she did because I was able to get through the bachelor's. Then a few years passed, I went into the master's. Then a few years after that, I went into the PhD, which has afforded me countless opportunities to help many people navigate situations just like mine. Because even though my grandmother was ailing, even though she had had some illnesses, nothing ever prepares you for losing someone that is so near and dear to your heart. And I want you all to understand, those of you who may be going through a grief journey of your own, don't be surprised if a myriad of emotions begin to coexist, because grief is very messy. Grief is not linear. It would be nice if grief was black and white. You could get it done in one instant, but there are moments when you will have sadness. There are moments when you will be angry, you will be depressed, you will feel bitter, you will feel guilty, and then there may be a moment where you have a happy memory. So whenever you're experiencing things in your mind that begin to coexist, don't think it's abnormal. Don't think it's something wrong with you. It's just something that you need to sit with, allow yourself to feel, and process it. And so now, fast forward to planning my grandmother's funeral. Now we had gotten past the news that she was gone. So now it's time for planning. And I remember driving with my mom and a few other family members up to the funeral home. But I remember that I was too numb to get out of the car. It's as though my feet had become stuck to the floor of the car and I was unable to get out, because at that moment, I'm still feeling like this is all a dream. I'm still feeling like this can't be real, that I am literally going to prepare to lay the matriarch to rest, preparing to lay the glue of our family, the one that held everything together. We're literally going to have to prepare to lay her to rest. But even though that was tough, I was able to get through it. And then a few days later, November 11th, 2000, which was a Saturday, was the day of the funeral. And once again, I remember all of my experiences. And I remember that as the black limousine that was carrying the family pulled up to the church, I remember getting very sick. I remember that I was nauseated. I remember getting out of the car. I remember throwing up. I remember being dizzy. And I remember being very unable to breathe for a few moments. And what I have learned now about grief that I did not know back then was that it definitely will impact the body, because there is a body and an emotional connection. And grief is something that happens on the inside. And so not only is it emotional, but my body at the time was having a reaction to the pain that I was in. And so after I was able to recover from the little small bout of illness, I was able to walk into the service. I remember walking down the center aisle, looking at my grandmother in the casket. But what I did was I just took a glimpse. I glanced and I went to sit down, because I could not bring myself to say that this is the last time that I will see her here on earth. And so then it was time to read the obituary. Once again, I glanced at it, but I couldn't make myself look at it the whole time, because once again, I was still traumatized. I was still in disbelief and shock that this was really happening. And another thing that I learned through my grief journey is that every little thing can be a trigger. So you heard me mention the black limo a while back, right? So for a while, black limos were very traumatizing. They were very triggering, because I could not drive past a black limo. I could not ride in a black limo, and I did not want to hear about a black limo, because it would send me over the edge. It would send me back into that moment where I had the worst day of my life. And it's one thing about our brains when we're going through grief, that our brains take pictures, our brains remember. And so every time I would see a black limousine, my brain would go back and grab a memory of this horrendous day that I was having. But however, I was able to get through the service, went through it. It was tough, but I made it. And I will say that I did not go to her burial, which was a couple of days after. because it was a veterans cemetery and they will not allow you to have weekend burials. And so the burial was going to be that Monday. And so I chose not to attend. I could have, but I chose not to because I was trying to spare my feelings. I felt like I've been traumatized enough. I felt like I've been through enough, and I just cannot force myself to be re traumatized. I can't reopen this wound that I'm trying to close. And so I chose not to go to that burial because I did not want to see my grandmother be lowered to the ground. I did not want to say that this is really it. This is final. And so I just chose not to go. But I just did what most church people will do, prayed about it, found my strength, and tried to move on. So, that's how we do in the church. We're like, oh, just pray about it. It'll be okay, and never deal with things again. But I came to the realization that that was not the best decision. I didn't allow myself time to process any of this because I was used to being the strength of everybody else. For whatever reason, people have always looked at me as the strong one. They've always seen me as the fixer of everybody else. But at that moment, I needed to be fixed and could not do that because I felt like I had to be there for everybody else. But on August 9th, 2024, I had an aha moment, which means that I made the decision to begin to deal with this pain and to begin to deal with the hurt. And so what had happened was from the year 2000 all the way to the year 2024, I was a dead man walking and didn't even realize that's what it was. So I had carried and suppressed what the clinical world would call hidden grief. It was suppressed. And so I had pushed it down so far until I thought dysfunction was normal. I thought that functioning the way I was functioning was the way I was going to function for the rest of my life. But it was on August the 9th, 2024. 24 years later, I reached out to a therapist who I am currently seeing. Yes, I am currently seeing a therapist, the doctor herself, the prayer warrior, the intercessor, the one that loves to preach the gospel is seeing a therapist because there's nothing wrong with Jesus and a therapist, right? Because we're not all spirit. We're also physical bodies. We possess a soul. We have a mind, a will, emotions. And so we have to learn to deal with every part of us. So it was at that moment that I reached out to this therapist and I told her a little bit about what was going on. And she told me all of the years of pent up grief had now begun to eat me alive. And she said, if you don't get help soon, you're going to continue to spiral down this rabbit hole that you've been in. See, I knew that there was something that made me want to desire help because I found myself being edgy, found myself being anxious, found myself being hypersensitive, hypervigilant, easily irritated. I was depressed, and people did not understand the level of depression that this had brought me into. I had spent months crying myself to sleep and nobody knew it because once again, I'm that private person. I'm that strong one. I don't let people into the intricate parts of my life. And so I felt at that moment I did not need to talk to anyone. But it was August 30th, 2024, my first day of therapy, where I began my healing journey. It was that day that I began to peel back the layers of all of the pain that I had been in. That was the moment where I sat on my therapist's couch and I began to take grief out of hiding and allow it to be put on display. And healing for me was a choice, and it was the best decision that I made. Healing has caused me to be vibrant. It has caused me to thrive on the other side of the pain. And one of my homework assignments that my therapist gave me, because I did not go to the burial 24 years ago, she said, your homework assignment is to make sure that you visit your grandmother's grave site to get the closure that you never have ever had. And so it was tough, but on this past Mother's Day, May 11th, 2025, I made a decision once again to visit my grandmother's gravesite to get that closure and to get that last point of reference of where she is. And so it was something that was very emotional. It was something that caused tears, and tears are welcome. Sometimes tears are healing. And so I can say that I walked away from that experience with a new mindset. I walked away from that experience healed. Now, my therapist wasn't saying that there's something I need to continue doing, because a lot of times when you continue to go to grave sites and to go to the place of the deceased, that tends to open up wounds again. It tends to put you in that downward spiral. So it's not something that you want to continue doing. But if that is something that would give you that closure at least once, then by all means be found doing that. And so, if you're in the beginning of your grief process, you may have these urges to want to visit quite a bit. But if you find yourself a year later or some years down the road and you're consistently going and visiting these people, then that's when you may need to go and get some help, because at that point you're getting stuck in your grief. And so I can say that I survived that visit to the cemetery, and it was not as bad as I thought, but it did bring healing to me. And so, what am I saying? I cannot reiterate enough that healing from the inside is a choice. And I had to do my grief work, and I am yet doing my grief work. There's other losses that I'm sure that I'm going to have to process. Every loss demands responses. And so I'm going to have to continue to work through things. But I will say I can feel that the pain has lifted. I can feel that I'm not burdened with the weight of grief over my maternal grandmother's passing as I was before. Because when I first started the grief journey, even in therapy, it felt like every time that I would have to discuss this story, it would always feel like it just happened. And it was 24 years ago, but it felt like it was new to me because I had never dealt with it. I had never processed it. And so whatever is being concealed can't be healed. And so I had to bring it to the surface, bring it to the forefront, and do my work in order to heal. So you may be saying, what does doing grief work really look like? First of all, being honest about your feelings, not hiding what it is that you're going through, being unafraid to talk about what's really going on. Now, if you're at the beginning of your grief journey, if it was a few months or if it was a week ago, you may not feel like you're at the capacity to speak about it, and that's okay. But at some point, allow yourself the strength and the courage to open up about what's going on, because if not, everything that we suppress is going to be stuck right here, and it's going to cause us to be dysfunctional. It's going to cause us the pain that we really can heal from. And so a lot of times when we are not talking about things, it sits in our hearts so strong until not only does it affect us emotionally, but it begins to affect us physically. Congestive heart failure is one of the causes, or one of the things that is caused by grief that has been held in. It's taking a toll on your heart. It's taking a toll on your physical body. And if you can avoid that, please avoid it and begin to talk. So that's one part of the work that I did. And then I also find myself journaling, because when you're journaling, you're writing things down, you're putting your pain on paper, you're making that mind and body connection to where you're becoming more aware of the things that are going on the inside of you. That if you had not written it down, you maybe would not even know what it is that you're facing. And so the journaling has helped me realize some things about myself. So what did I realize about myself through this journey? I realized that I was struggling with pride. What does that mean? Not being able to ask for help. I was too proud to ask for help because I am the helper. I'm the therapist. So why would I need one? Why would I cry out for help when everybody's depending on me? And so that pride spirit came out on paper, and it came out in my grief journey. And I also learned about myself that I wanted to control the narrative of my life. I wanted to know all the details. How long was this grief journey going to take? And when is this going to be over? But I had to realize that in order to heal, I had to be patient with myself. And I have to continue being patient with myself, because after all, it's a journey. It's a journey. It's not a race, but it's a marathon that we have to pace ourselves to go through. And so, after the journaling, after the talking, find yourself a support system, somebody that can help you walk through that journey. I had to find some people to help me walk through the journey, somebody that's going to know what to say, somebody that's going to know how to hold your hand. They're going to know when you're having emotions and don't feel like talking, and they're just going to be present. They're going to sit there and they're going to listen. That's the type of people you need in your life on your grief journey. And then, last but not least, seek professional help. Seek a therapist, seek a counselor. It is okay. It will truly save your life, because I can say that it truly saved my life. And so, what am I saying? I am saying that just like I had to be patient with myself, I had to give myself grace to go through the journey, and I had to do my grief work. It is essential. So that way you don't become stuck in your pain. Some of you may have lost not grandparents, but some have lost parents. You've lost your child, you've lost relationships, and some of these losses can be tougher than death losses. But whatever you've lost, it demands a response, and you owe it to yourself to do your grief work. And you will see that just like my story, you have a story. And just like I rose up out of the ashes of trauma and experienced triumph, you too can experience that victory over grief. Make the decision that pain will not grip me. Make the decision that I will not get stuck here, but there is purpose in my pain. And I want you to know that this is not just something I've heard. It's not just something I read while I was studying in school, but this is something I have experienced. I have the firsthand experience to tell you that it is possible to live life after your losses. So allow your pain, allow your grief to produce your purpose.